Although it is well known that the Soviet Union was a key participant in the defeat of Germany during World War II, the relationship between the two countries did not start out that way. Stalin served as an ally of Hitler during the early years of the conflict, taking advantage of the Führer's actions to expand his influence in Europe. However, the invasion of his territory by the Nazis in 1941 caught him by surprise. This forced him to take desperate measures. Recruiting criminals, enlisting women on the front lines, or threatening his own soldiers with death if they dared to retreat were just some of them. If you want to know more about this, you're in the right place. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you everything from the perspective of the Soviet Union during World War II. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933. As the years passed and his power consolidated, the Führer became increasingly daring. Provoking European allies, the Nazis annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939, respectively, without resistance. While Western powers protested against these territorial conquests, Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, saw an opportunity. He instructed his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov, to initiate talks with his German counterpart, Joachim von Ribbentrop. After both countries engaged in conversation, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed in August 1939. This was a non-aggression treaty between the German and Soviet governments, guaranteeing peace between them. However, there was also a secret clause in this agreement that divided Eastern Europe between the two powers. The Baltic countries, Finland, the region of Bessarabia within Romania, and the eastern half of Poland fell within the sphere of Russian interests. Despite this arrangement, Stalin was not fooled. He knew that Hitler had his territories in sight. But a peace treaty with the Reich provided him with time to strengthen his military power for an eventual struggle against the Germans. On September 3, 1939, Hitler ordered his troops to invade Poland, marking the beginning of World War II. 2 weeks later, to the surprise of many, the Red Army took the same action, as you can see here.
Red columns in a sudden drive have been hurled by Stalin across the Polish border on a wide front. The beleaguered Polish army, practically en route before the German onslaught, can offer but feeble resistance to the Soviet invasion. As the advancing Russian columns ride roughshod over what is left of Polish territory, the partition of Poland is arranged in Berlin and Moscow.
This was how the entry of the Soviet Union occurred much earlier than many think. The Polish army resisted for just over a month, but attacks from both fronts were too much for them, and they surrendered on October 6th. In this way, the country was divided in two, respecting what was agreed upon in the treaty. Soviet war crimes soon manifested themselves. Around 300,000 Poles were captured between late 1939 and early 1940. After intense interrogations, 22,000 of these individuals, mostly military and intellectuals, were labeled as nationalists and counter-revolutionaries and subsequently executed. These brutal mass murders are known as the Katyn massacre. The Soviet Union covered up all traces of this war crime and would only acknowledge its actions in 1990. Here we have the testimony of one of those responsible for this massacre.
My men didn't shoot more than 300 people a day. Only once did they shoot as many. That had to be done under the cover of darkness because the nights were now too short. So they brought 250 people at a time, and we shot them during the night.
Without any remorse, Stalin continued seeking to obtain the agreed-upon territory. The Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were practically threatened into signing mutual assistance pacts with the Soviet Union. If they did not, they would be invaded. These small nations had no chance against an attack from their gigantic neighbor, so they had to comply, and Russian military bases were established in their territory. Finland was offered the same deal, but the Nordics defied the dictator. Negotiations between them bore no fruit, and the country was invaded on November 30th, 1939, marking the beginning of the Winter War. The world expected the Red Army to crush the few Finnish defenders, but they were in for a surprise. Although much smaller in number than the invaders, the locals knew the battlefield perfectly and harassed their enemy with guerrilla tactics. The Soviets, on the other hand, were incredibly ill-prepared to face the harsh Finnish winter. Those who didn't die from the defenders' bullets perished by the thousands from the cold. However, the invaders' resources were infinitely superior, and it was only a matter of time before they overcame the defenses. After approximately 100 days and more than 200,000 Soviet deaths, a peace treaty was signed between the two countries. Stalin, who sought total conquest of the territory and the establishment of a puppet state, had to settle for a portion of it. Due to their poor performance in the Winter War, the reputation of the Red Army was severely damaged, and the Nazis took note. But the conflict also served as a lesson to the Soviets, and in the future they would demonstrate that they had learned from their mistakes. In mid-1940, while Hitler was carrying out his conquest of France, Russia accused the Baltic countries of anti-Soviet military collaboration. The three nations received ultimatums demanding the formation of new governments, with candidates provided by the Union. Just as before, they had no choice but to accept. Shortly afterward, Stalin ordered the annexation of Romanian Bessarabia, establishing the Soviet Socialist Republic of Moldavia in its place. Thus, with the exception of Finland, the territories agreed upon with the Nazis were already in their possession. For a year, Stalin continued seeking to maintain peace with Germany. There were even negotiations discussing his entry into the Tripartite Pact that the Nazis signed with Italy and Japan, but these bore no fruit. What he did achieve was signing a non-aggression treaty with the Japanese Empire in 1941. Thus, both parties recognized the puppet states established by them in China, and also conveyed to Hitler that they were not seeking confrontation with their partners. But the Führer had a big surprise prepared. On June 22, 1941, without any prior declaration of war, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in what marked the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. Despite reports from spies, Stalin didn't believe that Hitler would order an attack before defeating the United Kingdom, so there had been no mobilization of Russian troops to the front. The defenses were quickly overwhelmed, and within just 3 weeks, they had lost around 750,000 men. Immediately, Stalin appointed himself as Marshal of the Soviet Union, the highest rank in the Red Army, to have total control over his troops. Disregarding some of his generals, he ordered constant counteroffensives to try to halt the Nazi advance, but they failed without exception. His soldiers were not adequately prepared to face the Axis forces. All the territory conquered in previous years was now in German hands. Even Finland had allied with the Nazis and started the Continuation War, managing to reclaim the forcibly ceded territories. By the end of 1941, the Axis had advanced approximately 1,700 kilometers inland, and Soviet forces had suffered over 4 million deaths. We can hear a historian talking about this epic invasion.
The first days and weeks and months of the German invasion of the Soviet Union were a military catastrophe. But Russia was so vast and Russia's armies were so enormous that even though the Germans keep advancing and advancing, that it's not enough.
The German plan was an invasion with 3 main objectives. To the north, the city of Leningrad had to be conquered. On the other hand, the group of armies in the center had to advance and take Moscow. Finally, in the south, the purpose of the attack was to first conquer the fertile fields of Ukraine, and then proceed to the Caucasus, rich in oil. Fulfilling these missions left the Soviet Union with no real chances of victory, as it deprived it of vital resources and means of supply. The Nazis terrorized the population of the conquered regions. Prisoners of war were executed on the spot, or mass transferred to concentration camps or forced labor camps, where hundreds of thousands would die in inhumane conditions. It is estimated that 58% of captured Soviets died in captivity. Of course, civilians also fell victim to brutal war crimes. For the Nazis, the Slavs were as inferior as the Jews and did not deserve to be treated as human beings. The Einsatzgruppen, SS operational groups, were responsible for numerous massacres of innocent people accused of being partisans. In Belarus alone, more than 600 villages were burned, along with all the people living in them. In other regions, thousands of people were executed en masse. This was the case in Babi Yar, within Kiev, where approximately 30,000 people were shot in just 2 days. The German objective was to eliminate the population of the Soviet Union to establish their Aryan Germanic place. Their orders were that there should be no mercy for the citizens of these regions. Next, we can hear from a survivor of these massacres recounting the cruelty with which the Nazis acted.
Основное это он созвал этих людей на площади, вот 210 человек. Вот. И я дал им это, шефертиры, вы знаете, что это? Нет? Есть такая это, что складывается, потом она разнимается. И вот они это взяли и дали им, они по кусочку резали, бросали у костер. И когда это огонь уже погас, так они тогда их погнали в один дом, и там этот дом подорвали.
Stalin knew he had to change his strategy if he didn't want to see Russia fall. He began a grand movement of industries and personnel towards the eastern part of the Union, away from the front lines. This way, he didn't risk them falling into German hands. Those that couldn't be relocated were destroyed. The same happened with farms in the path of the invaders, following a scorched earth policy to deny the enemy their resources. Some peasants protested against the destruction of their crops, but without a word, the government arrested them. He also instructed the Red Army to assist in organizing partisan movements to carry out sabotage actions behind enemy lines. To replace fallen fighters, Stalin promised prisoners held in the gulags, forced labor camps, their release if they volunteered to fight, and obviously, many accepted. The desperation in the face of the invasion was such that women, usually employed as nurses or secretaries, were granted permission to join the front line. Many, due to their smaller stature, were used as snipers, being harder targets to perceive. As if all this wasn't enough, there were darker measures. To prevent retreats, commanders of the forces were ordered to shoot any man who took a step back. The threat was so clear that it was said, in the Red Army, it took more courage to retreat than to attack. That's how the German advance began to be hindered. In the north, the Nazis began to besiege Leningrad in September 1941. This city not only held great symbolic value, but also contained many industries vital to the Soviet war effort, as well as serving as a base for the Baltic Fleet. Because of this, Stalin moved a huge number of troops there. The city couldn't fall. The siege lasted for 2.5 years. It was the longest and most brutal of the entire Second World War. German artillery destroyed much of the city's historic buildings. The attackers cut off supply lines, causing the population to suffer a famine unlike any seen before. There were even cases of cannibalism. 1.5 million people, including both military personnel and civilians, died during this time. But Leningrad held out. German and Finnish troops couldn't achieve their objective. Let's now hear from one of the natives of this city who lived through these terrible moments.
Above all, when you recall it, you're astonished by the firm belief people had in their victory. You know, it seemed at the time when things were so hard, there were no grounds at all for such a belief. Take evacuation, for instance. It was a much more difficult problem than trying to get supplies to the front line. It was hard to persuade people to leave the city. They just wouldn't move. They said, we'll win. We'll beat the enemy soon. I'm not moving any place. Even today, I can't really understand some things.
The armies tasked with the conquest of Moscow were not more successful. By the end of 1941, the Germans were 25 kilometers from the Soviet capital, but couldn't continue advancing. A staunch Red defense stopped them completely, followed by a fierce counterattack that pushed them back tens of kilometers. This defeat was Germany's first in the entire Second World War. After this failure, Hitler, as Stalin had done, appointed himself as the supreme commander of the German army. His dreams of a swift victory against the Soviet Union were shattered. Nevertheless, the city was not out of danger, and the clashes in its surroundings continued. But the most well-known battles undoubtedly occurred on the southern front. The German armies here saw better results, having conquered the fields of Kiev early in the invasion. Now they had to take the Caucasus. The Soviets obtained most of their oil from this region. Without these reserves, their tanks, planes, and much of their military infrastructure would only survive for a short time. If they wanted to survive, it was vital to keep them under their control. But there was an obstacle in the Germans' path: the city of Stalingrad. It was here, in mid-1942, that the bloodiest and one of the most important battles of the entire Second World War took place. For 5 months, Germans and Soviets engaged in fierce combat in a city in ruins. They were forced to fight house by house, in brutal hand-to-hand struggles where knives were used as much as firearms. Stalingrad changed hands numerous times during that time, but the defenders held out because they had a great ally on their side. Learning from the mistakes of their war with Finland, the Soviets were prepared to face the cold. The Germans were not, and the winter became their executioner. Thousands died from exposure to the weather. A Russian counterattack in early 1943 trapped the German army, and despite Hitler's explicit orders to fight to the death, they ended up surrendering. You can see this in the following video.
The hammer and sickle of the Red Army completely broke down the enemy's will to fight, and the Russians are reaping the reward of their gigantic efforts as at point after point, whole detachments of German troops give themselves up. Now the white flag of capitulation has taken the place of the crooked cross.
This defeat of the Axis forces marked the turning point of the war. The Soviets, despite their millions of casualties, were emboldened by the victory and, armed with a renewed patriotic spirit, began to drive out the Germans. Stalin was also relieved by the invasion of Italy by Allied forces, which opened another front and forced the Nazis to divert their resources. Since Operation Barbarossa, the Russian dictator had begun discussions with Allied leaders to see what kind of assistance could be provided. While they did not allocate troops, they provided equipment and air and naval support. In return, Stalin promised to attack Japan once Germany was defeated. By the end of 1943, the Soviets had regained half of the lost territory, and their industrial military production was at a very high level. The conscripted men ensured that, despite the heavy losses suffered, the Red Army had millions of troops ready to continue the offensive. Even women were allowed to fight on the front lines. Stalin's strategy was working. By the time the Allies landed in France in mid-1944, the Russians had the German forces at a clear disadvantage. Exhausted, having to maintain numerous fronts simultaneously, and with few resources, they were increasingly pushed towards Berlin, the target of the attack. In this year, the invasion of Romania and the armistice signed with Finland also occurred, wiping these Nazi allies off the map. In early 1945, Hungary surrendered. Germany was alone. By April of that year, the Germans were cornered. They still had approximately 3 million soldiers, but they faced over 6 million Soviets on one front and another 4 million allies on another. Their days were numbered. On April 16th, the Battle of Berlin began. Stalin had given permission to his soldiers to be brutal against the city's population. The troops of the Red Army, feeling a terrible thirst for revenge, did just that. Civilian deaths exceeded 100,000. It is estimated that approximately the same number of women were raped, and many of them were murdered afterward. Another large number of victims committed suicide due to the traumas suffered. The Nazis fought with desperate fanaticism, but couldn't prevent the fall of the capital. On the 30th of that month, seeing that defeat was imminent, Hitler committed suicide. A week later, the Third Reich surrendered. The war in Europe thus came to an end, thanks in large part to the leader of the Soviet Union. Below, a general pays tribute to Stalin on the eve of the German surrender.
Товарищи, наш полк, как и вся славная Красная Армия, начала свой славный боевой путь от Сталинграда, где закончила прославутую банду немецких разбойников, которые уверяли о том, что нет таких армий в мире. Товарищи, мы закончим эту победу потому, что нашей славной армией руководит наш великий советский народ, великая наша партия, великий и мудрый товарищ Сталин. Ура!
But there was still another enemy. Keeping his word, in August 1945, Stalin declared war on Japan and ordered the invasion of the puppet state of Manchukuo. Russian veteran forces quickly advanced into the territory of the weakened Japanese, although they didn't get very far. The dropping of the nuclear bombs just a few days later led to their surrender on September 2, 1945. World War II had ended. Its impact on the population of the Soviet Union cannot be easily expressed. The national economy was severely affected, only recovering its pre-war levels in the 1960s. Due to bombings by planes and artillery, 25 million citizens were left homeless. Almost 2,000 towns and 70,000 villages completely disappeared. 27 million people lost their lives, with 19 million of them being civilians. Although it was one of the victors, it was the country that suffered the most casualties throughout the entire conflict. While it's necessary to mention the atrocities committed by the Nazis towards the Soviet population, one must not forget the war crimes committed by the Red Army. In a war that many historians wish to portray as good versus evil, as black and white, Stalin and his forces emerge as an undeniable gray. Of course, they were not the only victorious side to commit such actions. Even today, there is debate about the morality of the Allied bombing of Dresden, or the aforementioned nuclear bombs dropped on Japanese soil by the Americans. But the massacres of Poles during their invasion in 1939, the abominable treatment of prisoners of war, and the excesses committed against the population of Berlin turned public opinion against the dictator. We've reached the end of this video, and we want to ask you, what do you think of Stalin's actions during the war? Leave us your answer in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.